So treatment for a wide infrasternal angle with only primary compensations and a narrow with secondary compensations are very similar. And treatment for narrow ISA with only primary compensations and a wide with secondary compensations are also very similar. So to determine treatment options, is it almost more important just to see if that person is more concentric on the front side or back side, since the ISA is not that relevant when a person has secondary compensations? Good question, Leo. And the infrasternal angle is uber important in this primary and secondary compensation thing. Even though the limitations of a primary narrow and a secondary wide are similar, and same thing, a primary wide and a secondary narrow, the order at which they got there are different. They have a different structure. And the third thing is you have to prioritize things a bit differently in each of those cases. So let's unpack that. The first thing I want to talk about is prioritizing things differently in those cases. In order for movement to happen, we have to be able to create a gradient. A gradient is a thing where you have stuff of high concentration, so a large amount of things, moving to an area of low concentration. For example, if I had a bunch of people in somewhere studios breaking all types of social distancing because I'm a rebel, the only way that people can move out of somewhere studios and into my living room is if the living room is empty. If I got a bunch of people crowding the door, then I have no movement. These people are stuck in here. They're stagnant. I need to have an area of low concentration of people because somewhere studios is an area of high concentration of people. So if my living room was empty, well, then people could move out into the living room and disperse, and life is good. I need the same thing when it comes to movement of a human body. The way we move, instead of moving people from somewhere studios to my living room, is by alternating concentric and eccentric contractions, because concentrations change here. When I concentrically bias my wonderful bicep, there is a low concentration of synovial fluid on the anterior aspect of my elbow joint, but there's a high concentration of fluid in the posterior aspect of my elbow joint. And when I flex maximally, which I do on a regular basis, I can't move into flexion any further. What I have to do in order to induce movement is to push the fluid from an area of high concentration, posterior elbow, to an area of low concentration, anterior elbow, aka extend the elbow. That's how movement works. It works that way in the ventral cavity as well. If I'm someone who is concentrically biased on the back side of my body, a wide infrasternal angle with primary compensations, and I'm eccentric on the front side of my body, I have in the thorax a little bit of air in the back, a lot of air in the front. In the lumbopelvic area, I have the viscera, a lot of viscera in the front, not a lot in the back. In order for me to create movement within the ventral cavity, I have to push air posteriorly and viscera posteriorly. High concentration to an area of low concentration. So then, we have to ask, Leo, well, does it matter if I'm primary or secondary compensation? Absolutely. Because if you have someone with secondary compensations, you still have to respect the gradient of moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Let's say I have a narrow infrasternal angle with secondary compensations. Remember, if you were listening earlier, primary compensation is to concentrically bias the front side of the body. And then the secondary would be to concentrically bias the back side of the body. Well, in that case, because I'm squeezing both the front and the back, well, I ain't got much movement available because I've reduced the concentration of stuff. But consider this, and this is why I think thinking in sequencing is useful. You still have to, in that case, create a gradient. And if you think about it this way, if the primary compensation involves little tiny baby musculature, and the secondary involves the big dogs, I'm concentrically biasing the back side harder than I am the front side. In theory, there's a higher concentration or volume of stuff on the front side. It's like the battle between the transversus thoracis and my erector spinae. Who's going to generate more force? And how is that going to change where air goes? Ergo. Well, the erector spinae are bigger muscles, so they can push harder forward. So there's going to still be more air in the front, even though it will still be restricted. So what you have to do is you got to create a gradient. So I'm going to push where the air is on the front side back first in that case. Then if I open up that person's backside, that doesn't sound good, but you know what I mean. If I open up or I eccentrically orient the posterior aspect of that body, well, now I have another gradient. I got stuff in the back. You got junk in the proverbial movement trunk. Then you can push it forward safely without problems. If I went out of order and I work with that narrow primary compensation and secondary compensation and I push air into the front first, well, that could work, but you're battling against a stronger gradient because I have an area of high concentration of stuff already. It would be like Somewhere Studios is kind of filled to the brim and we're trying to push more peeps in here. We don't want that. I mean, the room ain't that big, good Lord. So you want to go where the secondary compensation is first because that musculature and those tissues are what are creating the gradient. So it is important. It's incredibly important in that regard. So if you have, let's say your first example, a wide ISA with primary compensation, they're concentric on the back, eccentric on the front, and a narrow with secondary compensations. So they're concentric front and back. For the wide, you're going to do things to eccentrically bias the back side. And for a narrow, you're going to eccentrically bias the back side first and then go concentric. So that matters. That's important. But then, now you're saying, well, Zach, it looks like the operation is still the same. You still got to push air in the back. So what's different with a narrow versus a wide? The difference is with addressing the concentric bias on the person with the primary compensation, you have to manipulate that person's structure to improve the movement dynamics in that area. The reason why the wide ISA has a concentrically biased backside is because that's the first adaptation to that person's structure. So what we have to do in that case is make the structure dynamic. So to improve posterior expansion on a wide ISA, I don't always drive like true posterior expansion with low reaches. Instead, what I do is I think about compressing the sides of that person to then change the shape of the relative shape of the rib cage to encourage the posterior expansion. Whereas for a narrow ISA, I would do a low reach or something similar to encourage the posterior expansion. Let me unpack that a little bit. A wide infrasternal angle, if I looked at them from the top down, they're going to be larger laterally, medial lateral, and smaller A to P. So if I compress A to P, in theory, I will expand front to back. If I do something that compresses the sides, maybe this is a side plank, could be a suitcase carry, could be anything like that, then that side compression will encourage A to P expansion, and a lot of times you'll see some nice changes in mobility from that. More also, too, what I've found with a lot of wides is when I do attempt low reaches, for some reason they just overpeck a lot of it and can't get the legit posterior expansion we want. To me, I found it a lot easier by compressing the sides. Whereas if I do that same movement with a narrow who has secondary compensations, well, they're already compressed on the sides. So that's going to magnify the problem. However, if you do a low reach, that doesn't compress the sides of that person's ventral cavity, and you can then achieve the posterior expansion that you so desire. Flip-flop that with the second scenario, a narrow ISA with primary compensations and a wide ISA with secondary compensations. Because this one, I think, it magnifies it even further. So the goal with both of those people is we need to get expansion on the front side of the body. If we're talking about reaching, if I'm trying to get front side expansion, I'm going to reach from 60 to 120. That's why with a narrow ISA, a lot of times I will cue just forward reaching at 90 degrees. And the reason why that is because that will allow for expansion of the rib cage laterally. It will squish the front and back a little bit so you can get that lateral expansion, and life is good. And that a lot of times will improve your anterior measures, your extension, adduction, internal rotation. If I do the same forward reach with a secondary compensated wide, well, remember, they still have that concentric bias on the back. And when you reach at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, because the scapulae are in more external rotation, don't worry, I got a debrief that'll link that will dive into that. Because the scaps are more ER'd, you're going to have a concentric bias on the back side. So guess what, folks? When I reach forward like that, I'm only reinforcing that bias backside. So I'm creating more tension on the backside of the body. And then I have thrown off that gradient because I have all of this altered tension going on. Whereas if I do a 120 degree reach, well, now I have a situation where I get better serratus anterior recruitment, which compresses the rib cage laterally. I don't get as much pec involvement. I have the upward rotation. A lot of times the scaps will be downwardly rotated in that case. And because as I get into more upward rotation, even though I'm more ER'd, the scapula begins to reorient into the scapular plane, which can in theory allow for some posterior expansion. So subtle difference, but respecting the structure allows me to get different outcomes. And it's not this plug and play where once the person's limited everywhere, the ISA doesn't matter. The last component that I would say matters with the infrasternal angle in this regard is the breathing strategy used. Because regardless if you have primary or secondary compensations, in order to make the infrasternal angle dynamic, you still have to use the same breathing strategy. A narrow is going to do softer exhales because I don't want to create all this excessive tension in the lower rib cage, which would negatively impact the diaphragm's ability to ascend. For a wide, I need a little bit more resistance to close the lower rib cage so we can get the diaphragm to ascend. So that's where you're doing an impression of a windy day is effective. So that's why understanding the primary and secondary compensations, how it relates to the structure of the ISA, still matters, even if a person has similar restrictions. I could conceive of two people having the same restrictions, the same measurement findings, but because one is built differently than the other, one's a narrow, one's a wide, you could go about it on different paths and get a good outcome. Now, are you going to screw someone up because you measured the ISA wrong and you went down the wide protocol when you should have went narrow? Probably not. That being said, I do think that going about it in this fashion ought to increase your probability of success because it's respecting the concepts of gradients, it's respecting that person's structure, and if you can do those two things, you will likely create some excellent movement adaptations in your people, and you ought to be in business.